It is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague across the courtyard, Reverend Patricia Duncan, who's the Associate Professor of the Bible and Early Christianity. She is going to be moderating this panel and introducing each of our panelists. So please help me welcome Dr. Duncan.
Good afternoon, beloveds. So good to see you here. We have 4 distinguished guests here with very many talents, many interests, a lot of experience to draw upon. I'm going to give you some information about each of them so that you know what you want to ask, but we hope to have plenty of time for your questions to these distinguished guests about the future of the church. Starting at the end, we have the Reverend Nathan Russell. Reverend Russell, him, has served as the senior pastor of Washington Avenue Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, in Elyria, Ohio, since September 2018. Prior to attending Brite, Reverend Russell earned undergraduate and graduate degrees at West Texas A&M University and completed postgraduate work in choral conducting and music education at Michigan State University. He taught choral music at the high school and collegiate levels for 7 years. In August 2012, Reverend Russell participated in summer theological program at Christ Church, Oxford University. He also completed coursework toward a PhD in curriculum studies here at TCU. And in March 2016, Morehouse College in Atlanta inducted Reverend Russell into the Martin Luther King Jr. Board of Preachers. Last year, he led Washington Avenue Christian Church in becoming a Green Chalice congregation, and following an amazing 2-month fundraising effort, in the summer, the church abolished $2.45 million in oppressive medical debt for Ohio residents. Next to Reverend Russell, we have Remi Shores, pronouns they, them, theirs. Having finished their BA in religion at Texas Christian University, Remi is now working on a Master's of Divinity at Brite Divinity School. Galileo is sponsoring them on an ordination track for ministry with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Called to Next Church ministry, Remi is excited to be on the frontier of online worship and community building in that mode. Their passions for justice, kindness, and beauty are all rooted in what they have learned in relationship with others. In covenant with their wife and brand new baby daughter and other co-conspirators at Galileo, they learned from the Imago Dei, the image of God, in folks around them, how to do ministry that is good for the world that God still loves. Next to Remi, please.
Thank you to God.
Next to Remi is DeShay Jackson, they, them. DeShay serves as Minister of Music and Worship Arts for The Gathering, a womanist church in Dallas, Texas. They hold a Master's in Divinity from Brite Divinity School with certificates in Black Church Studies and Gender Sexual Justice, and a Bachelor's in Music Education from my home state, Culver Stockton College in Missouri. Their narrative work can be read in the book Colors of Hope, a devotional journal from LGBTQ+ Christians. DeShay has performed with a host of instrumental and vocal ensembles in spaces such as the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and Bass Performance Hall here in Fort Worth, Texas. During their time at Brite Divinity, they served as vice moderator for the Brite Black Seminarians and served on the chapel worship committee as music liaison, worship leader, and student vocal ensemble director. DeShay utilizes a womanist viewpoint to explore the intersections of theology, spirituality, Black queerness, music, and cuisine.
Anything to share? Come to the table.
And finally, Reverend Nick Scott. Nick serves as Senior Associate Pastor at Arbor Lawn United Methodist Church here in Fort Worth, where his primary responsibility is leading their contemporary worship community called Rooted. Along with his fellow pastors, he also has helped create and provides leadership for Arbor Lawn's new worship experience that is intentionally inclusive of children, called Simple Worship. Nick finds meaning in his work by engaging with guests so they might understand their identity as beloved children of a good God and be connected through relationship to the Arbor Lawn community. He received his MDiv in 2016 from Brite Divinity School and lives in Fort Worth with his 12-year-old son, Cade. Nick says that he also seems to enjoy annoying people by relating everything to the Enneagram and telling people something he heard on a podcast recently. Thank you. All right, I'd like to start by giving our panelists just an opportunity to begin framing for us where they're coming from, what they're thinking about the future of the church. And I invite you to use this time to begin thinking about what you want to ask of them. We want to hear from the audience and make this a very interactive space over the next hour or so. So what I would like to do is to ask the panelists, many of whom, I'm not sure everyone, but many of whom were here this morning to hear Nadia Bowles-Weber, as I'm sure many of you in the audience were. So I'd like to take a kind of idea from her talk and see if we can go from there. And it doesn't matter who starts, I'll let you fight that out, okay? You have 2 microphones, so you can grab for them quickly. What, in light of the anxiety that we thought about this morning, I'd like to ask, what would be your prayer for the church to convert in its thinking about the future from anxiety to hope?
I guess I would pray for discernment in what are we anxious about, and I would pray for all of us to think really carefully about, there's a degree of anxiety about buildings and institutions, and I'm not trivializing that. That's real anxiety and real grief at the thought of some of our institutions not being ours anymore or not being sustainable in the future. But that's a really different anxiety from the future of the church. And so I would just pray for us to kind of keep those straight in our minds and our hearts and really think about what is an anxiety that is sad, but it's not going to destroy the church. There are still believers and worshipers, and that's always what the church has been and will be, and I don't think that's going away. And to convert that anxiety to hope, I would pray that we would find one another. Those of us who are anxious and hopeful, find people who are hopeful about the future of the worshiping body as more important than institutions, and find hope and inspiration in people like us who are gathered today and still thinking about this and working towards it and putting our resources towards it.
Kind of. I'll let you form it. In the United Methodist Church, I think I'm the only United Methodist on the panel. We're the latest mainline Protestant church to go through divisions related to LGBTQ plus inclusion, ordination, and marriage. And it's been really hurtful for many people. And there's really been no winners in the midst of it. some of my colleagues are pastoring congregations that are outside of the city, more rural congregations, and or suburban as well. And though they would like to stay UMC, many of their congregations voted by 2/3 to disaffiliate. Some to go to what's known as the Global Methodist Church, and others to become independent, others to join some other denomination, what have you. And in the midst of this, I've seen a lot of a pain from those pastors wondering what is next, or what does this mean for me to be a pastor who couldn't keep their congregation together. And I think there's a general anxiety in the church, especially the institutionalized church, of what it means to be successful. And we have lots of definitions maybe of what it means to be successful, but a lot of our sanctuaries look like this room right now. There's a few less of us in here than when Nadia was in here. I'm not quite sure why. But when we have a room that can fit this many, and there's only this many people in here, and they're not even sitting next to each other, it's hard to say, are we being successful? And so that creates anxiety. It's hard to imagine what's next when you feel like you're losing what you've always had. But what's been helpful to me, and I hope that it would be helpful to others, is to remember that in our call, whether as pastors or lay staff or just laity, is that we are not called to be successful. We are called to be faithful. And we might be paid to be successful, right? So our paycheck might depend upon that, but that is not our calling. Our calling is to be faithful. And so I would pray for us all to remember what it means to be faithful, but also to remember that our value in the eyes of God is not determined by how many people think that we're successful.
A reading from a novel called Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. This is a conversation between a client and her psychologist. Has anything happened to you since we last met? The psychologist asks. Zara gives her a troubled smile, because how do you answer that? So instead, she answers a question that's never been asked. Everything's become lighter, easier, Nadia. The banks aren't ballast anymore. 100 years ago, practically everyone who worked in a bank understood how the bank made money. Now there are at most 3 people in each bank who really understand where it all comes from. And you're questioning your place there now, the psychologist asks, because you no longer think you understand? Zara's chin moves sadly from side to side. No, I've handed in my notice because I realized I was one of the 3. What are you going to do from now on? The psychologist asked. I don't know, Zara responds. The psychologist finally has something important to say, something she didn't learn at college but knows that everyone needs to hear every so often. Not knowing is a good place to start. On Monday of this week, we heard the Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Williams speak about people of the way, people of the movement of the very best, most beautiful gospel good news of Jesus Christ. Though not the text of his lecture, Reverend Dr. Williams gave a shout out to John 14. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you are going. How can we know the way? We, the people of Ministers Week 2023, are imagining the future of the church. How many of us, like Thomas and the disciples, like Abram and Sarai, like all the Marys, are also questioning, how can we know the way? How can we know the future of the church, the divinity school, the denomination, fill in the blank? How do we move from anxiety to hope? Jesus hears these questions, these desperate and profound prayers from the depths of nowhere, and says, "Ah, beloved, not knowing is a good place to start."
And a good way to segue, because my prayer is almost a lack of expectation. And I say that because sometimes when we have expectations put upon us or even presented out, that when they don't come to fruition, there's a little bit of frustration, some anger, some lashing out. And of course, most of the time it's inwardly, we're just projecting out. So my prayer is that, one, we take note of the fact that if we want to be a open space, a welcoming space, or just simply we keep saying that we are the folks of Jesus doing X, Y, and Z, then I pray that we come together and do that, but we do it without this idea of our egos of saving each other, or this idea of saving somebody, or this idea of coming in and being the end-all, be-all to save somebody's soul. Ain't nobody needs you for that. My prayer is that we all take note the fact that if we want to make great change within our individual spaces, in our communities, in our world, that, of course, it starts with us. As simple as it may sound, if you cannot handle the things that trigger you, and if you don't know what triggers you, my goodness, will you go off on somebody? And what you thought was some type of moment to listen to another context became a way to center it around you. Your life is important. Every life is important, but every life does not need to be centered in every moment. So I want us to sit with the fact that when we've sat with ourselves to know ourselves and to be with each other, that we can sit and be, because the holy calls in that. We are part of the holy that says, I will be who I will be. It is in our divine DNA to continue to be. So let's sit with that being before we keep pressing and oppressing.
Right, thank you. I'd like to now open it up and to make a space for you to share what is on your heart and ask a question of one of these people or all of them together to draw from their vast experience here and to think together about the future of the church.
Hi guys, thanks for being here. I'm Kate McGee. I'm a Presbyterian pastor in Arlington. And Reverend Scott, you mentioned y'all are going through a change in denomination. We've been there as Presbyterians. All of you in different way, I imagine, are really good at bringing people along. And some of what I've heard in our time here together has been, we love what we're hearing here as pastors. How do we bring it back to our churches? And so I think one of my questions is obviously relationships are key to bringing people along, but have there been any forms or any successful that you have been able to bring people along the way of liberation, as Reverend Dr. Williams said? Have you guys found in your work and your ministry to be able to bring people along that movement that way, from anxiety to hope to liberation to healing? Has there been something in your ministry that has been faithful, not successful?
I'm going to jump in here because I want to shout out a friend of mine, Reverend Yadi Martinez Reyna, who is the head of Color Splash, which was a camp that we did for queer folks and the ally or co-conspirator, whatever word you want to use with it, for young folks, middle school and high school, to come to camp out in New Braunfels for a couple of days where they could just be themselves, go to camp, make s'mores, learn songs. Hi, if you've ever been to camp with me, you will know that I have a song in my pocket like that. It's just my love. But they get to come into this space and be their truest selves, or even get to explore what is or what can be their selves. And in this coming along, because what I have learned about at least my hard-headed self is that if I get pulled, I don't want to move, or at least create resentment out of that. It takes me a moment to be able to learn the lesson because I'm sitting with the resentment of being shifted without my permission. So with being with, middle school and high school, remember, they're forming, their mind is just shifting. And in the space, it really is allowing them to just figure out, like, okay, we do have structure. Like, this time we're going to do this time you're going to do this. And today we're also going to talk about what does it mean to be made as human? What does it mean to be expressing yourselves in gender? Like, what is gender? And we allow them to talk. And when you give people the space, because you can't give people full safety. That's impossible. But you can try to encourage a space of bravery where they step in and they feel enough of the spirit to pull them to say, oh, I want to ask this, or I want to talk about this. That was the pulling along that I got to be a part of, that wasn't necessarily me having to move any human, but it was a matter of just saying, hey, we're in this space together. You have the floor.
One of the things that our senior pastor, one of the best things that he's done is when he first came in, he said, I'm going to bring 3 focus areas. And those 3 focus areas were discipleship, ministry with children and students, and reaching people we aren't currently reaching. And that's been so helpful to us because he keeps repeating those over and over again. And there are also 3 focus areas that it's difficult for anyone to disagree with. You know what I mean? As a church, we're going to be about discipleship. No, we shouldn't. What do you mean we shouldn't do? We're supposed to be about following Jesus, right? Ministry with children and students. Some people may act in a way that is anti-children and students, but they're not going to say that they're anti-children and students, right? And reaching people we're not currently reaching, we're supposed to be evangelistic in some way, even if we're not responsible for saving them. We're supposed to at least be open and invitational to them. And so, once you continue to have these focus areas, then you can begin to, over time, it wasn't, he came in the first day and the second day we switched all our resources over. It's still a slower process, but you begin to be able to say, okay, we're going to greenlight this ministry. And when someone says, why are we doing this? We can say, well, because we're focusing on these areas. And you're still going to do things that a lot of people aren't going to like, right? And you say, okay. And you don't have to get them to agree with you on everything to do something. When we started Simple Worship, many people were upset about this because we were taking a time that used to be dedicated to traditional worship. There were 2 identical services at 8:30 and 11. So we took the early service that time, and people were very upset about this. But some people were on board with it. And so we have to just allow those people to be upset for a while. But now they don't say anything because they see that we have so many children who are hearing about how loved they are. And now to take a stance against simple worship is in a way to take a stance against children. That may seem manipulative, but I just say it's hopefully being faithful. Or at least defining yesterday in the imagination workshop, he said, you got to draw on the line in the sand and say, and have 1, 2, or 3 things there. You don't want 25 things. But if you have some things, this is what we're about. And this is where our line in the sand comes. If you can get people to agree on some of those things that they would look stupid disagreeing with, that might help to bring some people along. You're not going to get them all, and that's okay.
You remember that story when Jesus calls some of the first disciples in Matthew's gospel, there's Peter and his brother, and then James and John. The Greek in that is Jesus calls them. James and John get out of the boat, and Zebedee stays put. The call in the Greek was to all of them. Only two said, okay. As clergy, I think we have to let go of the idea that everyone is going to come with us. Some people prefer to stay in the boat and repair their dilapidated nets than taking a chance on Jesus and following newness. Second, my beloved colleague, best colleague ever at Brite Divinity School, the Reverend Dr. Valerie Forstman, she taught me in recruiting students that her job was to hold up a mirror and before people and say, do you see what I see? And as clergy, we have that responsibility with the church to narrate their life back to them, say, do you see what I see? And as I said to a colleague yesterday, you are further along than you realize.
One thing Nadia mentioned this morning was when there was like an evaluation going on about her church plant, and they were supposed to figure out the 2 areas that they were doing the worst at, and then they were supposed to dedicate all their time and resources to that. And I think that's kind of the worst idea ever. But maybe that's a little strong. But I mean, and this is kind of what Nadia was saying, that why don't we spend time doing the things that we're good at? Because whatever we're bad at is probably what the church down the street is good at. So, like, the body is covered, she said. So, minister to the health is the phrase I've heard about that. And I think, to what Nathan was saying, not everyone is going to come along, and so we don't spend all of our time and energy and resources and prayers and emotional investment chasing after the people who are not coming along. We spend it in discipleship with the people who are coming along and inspiring one another, and that's how we convert anxiety to hope, I think, is find hope in the people who are coming along with us rather than being anxious in the people who they've said no, so let's stop asking them.
There, gentleman in the middle, the question.
I would like to focus on an issue, changing gears here, focusing on a specific issue that faces, I'm sure, every congregation. The pandemic was a bombshell to our churches. As a result of that, we ended up doing a lot of streaming, and streaming seems to be an issue which is very, very important. My question is to, we're talking about the future of the church here, and streaming is part of that. How can we do that effectively? And such things as one of the things like, what do you do with announcements, and so forth like that? How do you stream effectively?
I have opinions about this, but one of them is that, as we were just saying, not everything is everyone's to do, and I think that one thing with streaming is that during the pandemic we all had to stream. We don't all have to keep streaming forever, I don't think. I mean, maybe someone will disagree with me, but I think some of us have found that our congregations do that really well, and some of us haven't. And if it's not going well, let it go. It's okay. If you don't have a lot of people watching your live stream or engaging on your live stream, but you have people coming in person and that's where your community is, I think that's okay. I don't think we all have to do it amazingly. Now, if there's like some spark of like creativity or there's some community happening, and even if it's really small right now, but you think, I actually think, I have reason to think that our church is going to be good at live stream, or we could be, or there's potential here, then I think what's really important is to think about it not just as streaming a service out, streaming content out. We have content here, and we're going to put it on the internet for consumption, but rather we're expanding our community, not just with our music and our preaching, but are there opportunities for people who are watching online to talk to each other? Are there opportunities for them to talk to the pastor and to talk to people who come in person? Do the people who come in person know that there's an online community, and are they interested in building relationships with those people? I think if we're going to do church online, we have to do the whole thing online. It's not just content for consumption. So.
You open Pandora's box. Streaming is going to be different for every congregation based on the infrastructure that is available in the church and the technological dexterity of the people within the church. So in my congregation, we do not, quote unquote, live stream because that also requires a certain amount of internet bandwidth. So if you're in a rural area, it could really stink. So what we do in Rust Belt, Ohio, is we record worship on a Sunday morning. I go to my office for the next 4 hours, edit it in iMovie, push it to YouTube, and then we have a live premiere through YouTube on Sunday evenings at 6 p.m. So that's already a different context of streaming versus live streaming. Here are some things that we've noticed. Accessibility must be part of the conversation when we talk about streaming. A 93-year-old found my congregation through a Google algorithm, and she has stayed because we put the lyrics on the screen. We don't have screens in our sanctuary, wink, wink. But we put lyrics on the screen for YouTube, and she said they are large enough for me to read, and YouTube provides closed captions. Not in the realm of my thinking about accessibility, but part of the conversation we have to consider when we broadcast worship. A word of caution. I fear we are further creating consumers of worship more than we are participants in worship. We are creating a context of worship on demand where people can curate a worship experience of singing the hymns they want to sing, listening to the preachers they want to listen to, so it can feed into this culture of I, me, my God, my truth, etc. So the response to your question is, if we are committed to doing some type of online stream, how can we do that well with the resources that our congregation has?
I would say in the congregation that I serve, I imagine that right now our online live streaming of our worship services, it doesn't seem that we're bringing any online only folks. So it seems to be more geared towards those people who are not able to attend in person are still able to participate in worship. And I think that has a value all of its own. So, I mean, also we invested a lot of money in these cameras and that sort of thing, so we're going to continue doing it. But also, something you just said, Nathan, reminds me of something I say to people when I ask them, I take them to coffee, and I say, give me a question, why do you want to go to church? Right? Which is a weird question to ask because it makes them sound like I don't want them to be there when I do. But I want to get to an understanding of what they're hoping what they're thinking I would be able to provide for them. And sometimes I tell them, there might have been a day where going to church was the only way you were going to hear good preaching, right? That's no longer the case. No offense to a room full of preachers, right? Because they can find a podcast or their favorite pastor and just listen. If you could find, you just listen to Barbara Brown Taylor all day if you wanted to, and why not? She's great, right? No offense to DeShay, I'm sure your music is amazing, right? But you don't go like it used to be the only place you could go to get perhaps in your community to make sure you got exposure to great music, right? But at least in my setting, probably the people's music we're going to be singing, they're going to be touring through town. At some point, go to like they go there with 10,000 other people and a much better light show than we're going to be able to provide them. And so it's got to be about community. Yeah. And so why I'm so interested in the short time I got to talk to you in the green room. Did you know there's a green room with Remi? Is that they were telling me about some of the work they do and how it's community. Right now, my church doesn't have anything related to community. But if I were getting people to engage online, I would want there to be something that actually made a difference in the way they were living their life, and actually a relationship. Do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, I was going to ask if I could add something. I know you probably have something to say too. But just because you're right, you can find good preaching anywhere. I mean, really good preaching, like for free on the internet on demand. But those preachers are not preaching to you necessarily. They don't know you. A good pastor is going to be not just exegeting their text every Sunday, they're going to be exegeting their congregation. And if you're a part of that congregation, they know who you are, or at least someone in the church knows who you are. And there's a sense of where this congregation is in its life together, and there's a word of good news, not just for the world today, but for this church today. And if you have a robust online community where the pastor knows the online people too, then even in your online church, that pastor's preaching to you. And that's why I think going to a live stream church that is your church, where you're involved in the community, is really different from just looking up a YouTube sermon from one of your favorite pastors.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
These folks have said a lot of lovely things, so I'll be brief in this and that. The gathering just celebrated its 5th anniversary, and the joy of celebrating 5 years of that is we have been hybrid since day one in this. The gathering has been reaching out to its online folks and its in-person folks within the Dallas DFW area since day one. And so when the pandemic happened, it wasn't a startling thing in the sense of shifting our worship or shifting our model. The joy of the gathering also is that we are a community that has learned how to move from one space to another that originally didn't have a space. We still don't own a space, but we're thankful for the spaces that we're in. And in that, we have also still managed to have ministry partners from, I believe, at least 11 other states, and we have a member from Jamaica as well. So we still do that type of engagement where, especially those weeks where we are just online. We have 2 weeks where we are in person and it is still online as well, and 2 weeks where it is just online. And we try to find ways to where we invite our ministry partners to engage with us. So as the Minister of Music and Worship Arts, I look to folks to do things like our Womanist Welcome that reads off our missional priorities and such. And you get to see a face of the ministry partners that you might not see at the service that is in person. And kind of working with that, it's a growing thing, but it takes that type of intentionality. We're continuing to grow in our technology and our understanding and recognizing that as a team, we all have our gifts, but of course, if that's not where our abilities lie, can we hire somebody? And if we can't, okay, how do we move forward in that? We don't want to sit on something that's not going to work. And that's been the point of that, is that we want to be out of the mindset of surviving and into thriving. And if you're constantly trying to figure things out and stuck in survival mode, you'll miss so much. So the gathering has been really, I believe it has been good about implementing this idea of both and, learning from what we've started from and continuing to learn new technology.
All right. Another question here?
As you imagine the future of the church, do you imagine denominations?
We're jumping at the chance to answer this question. Thank you. My denomination is splintering. This day and age right now, we seem to be, it seems to be a time of tribalism where we continue to surround ourselves with people who agree with us and dehumanize those who disagree with us. Which makes me sad. I tell people when we talk about different denominations is that often, at least this is how I try to explain it to them, because I don't want to be like, well, that denomination's wrong and we're right. I'd rather speak positively about who we are than negatively about who someone else is. Although I have some negative things to say, I just try to keep it to myself. Is that different denominations and different groups have emphasized different aspects of the faith. If you use the Wesleyan understanding quadrilateral, which I know other folks are familiar with, scripture, reason, tradition, experience, is that you're going to see different groups and denominations are emphasizing different parts of that, right? So Catholic tradition, right? Bible churches, supposedly the Bible, and things like that. Perhaps a Pentecostal church might be more about, they really emphasize the experience, perhaps. And I feel that it's a shame that we have decided not to learn from one another, and instead say, no, we have found God because we focus on this, and since you focus on that, then you're wrong. So I'm not sure that denominations are bad. I happen to be United Methodist, and I don't imagine seeing myself serving in another denomination. But I don't know anything anymore. COVID, one thing it did for us is help reveal that we only thought we had some control, and we don't have any control. Things could change overnight. And I'm seeing a lot of similarity in thought with my siblings up here, and I'm not in the same denomination with either one of them, any of them. And so if the United Methodist Church, if it were to fall, as sort of Nadia has suggested, the church is going to be just fine. I don't know what you said. You say you like the next church, right? I don't know what that's going to be, denominations or not, but some initial thoughts to get us going.
There was some talk around the time of when emerging church was a really big buzzword and a really big movement. Nadia was a part of that. Brian McLaren. There's the Wild Goose Festival would meet. I think, do they still meet? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I think there was some talk of like, what if you were emerging church ordained, like you were ordained with the emerging church, or what if it was like a new denomination that was sort of this amalgamation of pastors and churches and voices from all denominations, but who think this certain way in this emerging church way. And I think, if I understand correctly, the reason it didn't really work is mostly the sacraments. There's different ideas about sacraments. So if some denominations have a much more rigorous ordination than others, and so now I have to accept your denomination that took 3 years when mine took 10 years, or and then when do we baptize people, and do we accept other baptisms, and who gets to take the Eucharist and who gets to serve the Eucharist? I don't have answers to any of that, but I mean, in the future church that Nadia imagined, where people are going to get together and they're going to tell the story, and they're going to break bread and say, and it was to save us that Jesus died and that Jesus rose again. I don't imagine people in those house churches quibbling about who's serving that bread. So I don't know that if we get to that point, it's really going to matter so much.
I remember in elementary school, someone said, "What religion are you?" And I said, "Christian." They're like, "No, what religion?" I'm like, "Christian." People in the church writ large don't know the difference between religion and denomination. I would argue that many of us can articulate those differences, but I don't know that that is of paramount importance to the world. Here is my hope for denominations, that they may all be one. And here's what I think that could look like. Consortiums. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ, after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, ceased to offer health insurance for its clergy. So my only option for health insurance is Obamacare, and I'm not going to marry my partner for the sole purpose of getting health insurance. We should have a consortium among our denominations to provide health insurance. We should have a consortium among our denominations, and dare I say it, even within the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, to combine our higher education and leadership institutions. Could we have a chancellor of all of our disciples' institutions, so that someone could take a course at Transy, TCU, Barton, Brite, Phillips? I better stop.
Like that, anything? All right. I think we have time for another question back here in the back. You have two? All right.
So I manage our TikTok account for the church, and I recently received a comment from somebody that said, "Thank you for breaking down the stuff that we have taken for granted for so long in our worship." And it made me start thinking, because incidentally teaching somebody something that I didn't realize. Are there things that you have discovered that in your context that people don't know that we have always assumed that they should or do? And what are you doing to address that?
We just started an initiative at Washington Avenue called Becoming WACC. I stole that idea from Broadway Baptist here in Fort Worth. Peace be upon them. And we wanted something for people who are newer to come in and ask questions. What we have found also, that people who have tenure also ask these questions. So we had our first iteration of that last Sunday in January, standing room only crowd, and people were so excited to learn or learn again things about the church.
What I love during our service is we have a segment called Talk Back to the Text. And once again, if you've not checked out The Gathering, a womanist church, you can find us online, Facebook. Go ahead and sit with the Talk Back to the Text, because people that are in the room and in the virtual room can ask questions of the pastor that revolve around their sermon, that revolve around the text, that might just revolve around something that has popped up in their life, whether it is a statement or a question. But what we try to do is, one, demystify things, two, allow it that we all come to it, we all come with questions, and we all have, I'm not going to assume that, some of us have a shame and guilt that has been pressed upon us or learned or inherited from the ways of reading the text, and this becomes a communal space where liberation can happen, to where the text no longer becomes an idol, or actually not even idol, it no longer becomes God, but it becomes lessons. It becomes the things that are a part of us that are wholly like us too.
I think transparency is a huge part of Next Church, because I think young people don't any longer trust institutions just because they're institutions, and they don't give institutions their money just because they're institutions. So I think transparency about how we do worship, why we do it that way, where we spend our money, why we spend our money that way, is a huge, huge part of, you're not going to get young people to come in your doors, much less give you some of their money, if they don't know these things. So at Galileo, we have sort of like a course, I guess, called G101, where we try to make explicit things that are sometimes implicit or even hidden. That we don't want it to be hidden, and we don't even want it to be implicit where you have to guess about it. We want to tell you all about some of our church history. It's some denominational history, because a lot of new people at Galileo are not necessarily disciples. And it's some of our inside jokes, and it's our budget and our infrastructure. And yeah, it's usually like 4 to 6 weeks, an hour and a half night, and it doesn't have to be a membership class. You don't have to be considering becoming a co-conspirator, which is what we call members. But yeah, it's just, and some people who've been around for a long time, like Nathan was saying, will come back just for a refresher, and they'll be like, I actually never knew that. I've been around for 5 years, and how did I not know that? So, yeah.
Thanks. I used to work in Arlington. Like you did, I worked at First United Methodist Arlington. I remember passing by, sorry about that, an old school Baptist church there. And on their sign it said, we do church the right way.
Okay.
And I thought to myself, who are they talking to?
Wow.
Who do they want to come in? People who already have an expectation of what church should be like, right? I saw how people responded to Nadia Bowles-Weber's organ jab this morning, and so what I say very cautiously, okay? We have a very expensive organ in our church, and when you get an expensive organ, you're going to not just let anybody play it, so you're going to also have to pay a pretty good salary for that organist. And then if you have an expensive organ with the expensive organ player, you're going to use it, because you don't buy a Mercedes and then just junk it out, right? You got to keep it up. But who is hungry for organ music? People who are churched. Because where else do you experience organ? Right? Now you may say to yourself, oh, they're hungry for it, but they just don't know it yet. Right? And that might actually be true. They might have an appreciation for organ music, and that you could help them understand what that would be. But I find that a lot of our folks, they want to get younger, right? And they want to get more people, but they want everyone else who's not already in the church to like exactly what they like, right? Which is ridiculous. It might be that you already have all the people who like what you like, Now, Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have anything that the way of your life and the way of your worship is not something that is significant, or that you can help other people have an appreciation for. Because I certainly have learned from other traditions that I did not grow up in. And so to explain those items of worship as you go along, I once went to a Catholic church. I had no idea what was going on, like not in the least. Someone was helpful to me and said, okay, now we're on this page. We switched books, now we're on that page. I didn't know what was happening. To be aware always of what it's like for someone walking in the door. Or perhaps what is actually desired by those who don't come inside your doors. In simple worship, we don't always, to be honest with you, we don't always do a great job of this, but our initial idea was that we wanted to be a place where people, where children could, it was very inclusive of children, but also that for those who don't necessarily have an experience of growing up in the church or growing up in our tradition, would be able to understand the meaning of the things that we're doing. And so we try to remove the assumptions of what we're doing, right? And so we might say, and we're going to have, if we have a call to worship for that particular service, and sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, we explain what a call to worship is for, right? Or if we have, a lot of our songs might be more contemporary, but we always have a teaching hymn. And we don't just sing it. We talk about the meaning of the hymn. We might say, this is my favorite verse from this, or this is the story of the person who wrote this. And this is why this has always been significant to us as a church. Or this is why we chose it for this. And you say, well, I don't want to bog down the service, but you don't want to bog down the service for the people you already have, is what you're saying. Are we creating experiences that people that aren't already in our churches might want to take part in and actually feel like this is a place where I can be incorporated into?
The organ recital is at 3 o'clock.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I'm going to go.
I think our final question is in the back.
My name is Namsun Kang, and I'm a faculty member at Brite Divinity School. I really appreciate all the panelists, and if I have sufficient time, I would want to ask a really specific question to each panelist, but because of the time constraint, I have a really specific question to Reverend Nathan Russell. I was really drawn to your opening remarks. You mentioned about not knowing. And in the church, I mean, most of the people, they are occupied with this assurance and certainty and knowing. So perhaps in a meeting like this, we have to think about the church of already, but also church of not yet. And you are mentioning this ministry of not knowing. Find it really interesting for me because it is really directed to the church of not yet and ministry of not yet. So would you, elaborate more about your ministry of not knowing? Thanks.
What a gift, Dr. Kong, for somehow these tables to be turned and to receive a question from you. There's the great story in Genesis 12. The unknown, unnameable God calls Abram. Abram's never heard of this divine before. And the call is to go from to the land that I will show you. That land is occupied. As a little bit of a side note, I was called out of Texas to a church in Elyria, Ohio, that was occupied by a pastor who had been there 33 and a third years, called to the church when I was in kindergarten, stays in the church. It works, believe it or not. Hebrews 11 says that Abram went out, not knowing where he was going. That's the phrase that I would have to claim as a life verse, that we as the church are always to set out not knowing where we are going, but trusting the one who calls himself the way, the movement, the road, the hodos, the exit, the journey. And for me, the opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. And the more we can model as clergy that we are seeking with and alongside and holding loosely to what we claim that we know, I hope that empowers all of us to be in awe of the one we can never know or fully, definitively name. And maybe then, just as I said at the beginning, not knowing is a good place to start. Go from, hold loosely what you think you know, be in awe of all that you will never know.
Thank you very much, panelists. This has been very rich. If I could add one thing that I think is on the subject here, I would like to share that in my department at TCU, we have a grant called the Religious Leadership Grant. This provides 50% of tuition to students who qualify for it. And the stipulation is that they intend to go into full-time religious leadership. And the grant used to be, until this year, called the Church Vocation Grant. But because we realize that religious leadership is changing and can mean many different things today, and as we go forward into the future, we are eager to open that up and expand it. If you know young people who are ready to embark on college, or people of any age, I had a grandmother in my Greek class who was getting her BA and went on to SMU for her MDiv. If you know those people, send them our way and allow us to make this opportunity available to them. We have years where we have not given away the money, so it's there for those who are interested. With that, would you help me thank these wonderful panelists?
Always a joy. Yeah.
You too.